We've got to move on with our main speaker, Michael Coffman. Go ahead. Okay. And what has to be a miracle from God, Dr. Michael Coffman played a key role in stopping the ratification of the Convention on Biological Diversity's Biodiversity Treaty in the U.S. Senate an hour before the Senate was scheduled to vote on its ratification. His maps and information have been used by local citizens across America to stop the global agenda at the local level. This includes 2 UN biosphere reserves. He has been a featured TV guest on the Outdoor Channel, C-SPAN, and numerous national radio shows, and many, many others. He has also published many books, which some of you have already seen over at the table. Dr. Michael Coffman will be talking to us in 2 different segments. The first one will go right prior to lunch, and then after lunch we'll have the opportunity to hear from him again. Michael Coffman also wrote the book Plundered, which details the progressive ideology in both political parties that have taken over public education, the mainstream media, and America's political institutions during the past 100 years.
One of the things that I'm going to start out with is just giving you a little bit of background of who I am. I have taught about 30 years in a university setting in different parts of the country, have done research on a variety of different things. In fact, I led a multi-million-dollar research effort on global warming during the late 80s and early 90s. And it was during that time when the Congress reauthorized the Clean Air Act in 1991. The United States itself had averagely spent about $2 or $3 billion on research on acid rain. We did a lot of research on global warming. I was working for the paper industry at the time, leading this, using the university systems to do the research. And what we basically found was that, yeah, acid rain was an issue. Global warming was an issue. In the case of global warming, it was very unlikely that man was causing the problem. And we had a situation where we had really no justification for really expanding the Clean Air Act that was originally created in 1977. And Congress went ahead and reauthorized the Clean Air Act and expanded it tremendously, way beyond what the science showed was necessary. And I had been getting an inkling for a few years, since the late 1980s, that there was something wrong, that we weren't really using science to justify policy. We were using a political agenda as this country. When they reauthorized the Clean Air Act in 1991, it was very clear to me. When I investigated what it was, I was in a state of shock, realizing how bad this really was. What a huge, huge agenda this truly was. And as a consequence of that, I basically started then to develop understanding of what was going on. I was very much involved in the Rio Summit down in Rio de Janeiro, the Earth Summit. I didn't go down there, but I was involved from the United States and saw the horrible, horrible things that were coming out of that. Foremost amongst them was Agenda 21, which by the show of hands earlier today, most of you have heard about and probably are quite familiar with. And it looks like my computer is not going to boot again. Don't ask me how it happens just in meetings, but we'll see. Sometimes it does take a long time to boot when it's in this kind of a mode. One of the things that I really want to talk about today is what has been happening. How did we get where we are right now? Because it didn't happen by accident. And we are dealing with things that you don't really fully understand what is happening. And you have to have an understanding of who your enemy is if you're ever going to defeat them. And we have a major enemy. We're seeing them every day. Those of you who have to work with our federal agencies are seeing it every day. And I'm going to show you exactly what happened and when it happened to turn our federal government against its people. It's really a shocking type of thing when you fully understand the magnitude of what is really going on. And then I will talk about this afternoon a little bit more about the EPA and what it's doing, because right now the EPA is the enemy of the American people. There is just no question about it. They are the enemy of the American people. And where's my cursor? It's not good. There it is. I hope to avoid this. Well, I'm just going to start out with a discussion of our founding principles. I'll rush through them when I finally get the PowerPoint up. But I want to make a contrast for you, because we're going to be talking about a war of worldviews. This is my book, Plundered, that I just have finished. It's also in my book, Rescuing a Broken America. Some of you have had that book. I was here in Washington, Idaho, and so in Oregon 2 years ago when I published that book. And by the way, that book, Rescuing a Broken America, the foreword was written by blank. Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rogers. Some of you know her. The key point at this point is that our founders had experience with what was going on in the world. Michael, in his last presentation, mentioned the fact of the Magna Carta. England had had in effect the Magna Carta for almost 400 years when John Locke began to discuss what a government should consist of. And he basically identified the key component of a free society as being private property rights. And private property rights can only be done so that basically everyone had access to the private property. The old feudal system of Europe, only the kings and the royalty and the Catholic Church could own property. And John Locke said that's a sure way of basically creating poverty. Instead, if you have private property rights guaranteed by the government, everyone will have an opportunity to share in the wealth creation ability of private property. And that's what we basically used in our Constitution in developing our Constitution. It is a phenomenon that is unique in the history of the world. I'm going to reverse that triangle that was shown just a few minutes ago to show you a little different perspective. But here we have a scale of 100% tyranny to 100% anarchy. And basically, our foundation is based on the principle of God-given and unalienable rights. That's in our Declaration of Independence, and it's actually in the Constitution, although the words are not used there. That's what our Constitution is based upon. We have unalienable rights that the government can neither give nor take away. They can protect, but they cannot take it away. If they do, you're running into trouble. We as individuals are the sovereigns. Not that we can do anything we want to, but we are the sovereigns over government, and we give a certain amount of our power to the local city government. Our community government might be the county government, regardless. They are the ones that have direct influence in the legal system over our lives, and we have allowed that to happen. The state government is a layer of administration in which we have a little bit larger scale, basically, of government that handles certain other portions of our day-to-day life. But the key point here, and it's why the Articles of Confederation did not work, is that the federal government has the least power of all. Now, why is that? It's because they're the furthest away from the people. And as a consequence, they cannot adequately justify our day-to-day existence. Their primary decisions are confined to 18 enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 18 of the Constitution, mostly dealing with international affairs, military, trade, and other things. As we heard earlier this morning, one of those is that they only have very limited access to property. They're not supposed to be holding property according to Article 18, Section 1, except as well-defined characteristics of forts, arsenals, and other needful buildings. So why is it that now we have a federal government that basically is controlling every aspect of our life? Well, we have allowed that to happen, and I'm explaining exactly how it did. But the Constitution itself was not designed to give us our rights or limit our rights. It was designed to limit the power of government over our lives. Because government is raw power. And unless it's checked, it will control our lives. Every one of our founders said that. And as a consequence, they designed a tripartite system of government, legislative, executive, and judicial branches, that have independent power, to spread that power amongst many things, including not only the federal government, but right down to your local government, so that no one entity of government has enough power to take over. Well, we've lost that. The key component of this was penned by John Locke, in fact is repeated many times with the writings of our founders, is that the purpose of government is to join together to unite for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estate, which he calls by the general name property. The great and chief end, therefore, of men uniting in commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. The whole purpose of government is to preserve your private property rights. Our founder said the same thing. I don't have the time to go into it. But the question is, are you there? Or is your government protecting your private property rights? No. What we've heard from every speaker this morning is that the government's trying to take away your private property rights, to steal them. It's reversed its primary purpose. And the key component here is that private property rights, if you look at the x-axis or the bottom axis, really does control the level of prosperity of a nation. Why? Because private property, I can go into another half an hour discussion of why this is true, but private property rights are the key component to wealth creation. The key component. And while there are other things that are involved, that's why the correlation coefficient, the R-squared value, is not 100% or 100, is because other things do influence it. But the key component is private property. And we're in the process of having our private property taken away from us. And therefore the legal protections to go along with it. But there's another leading opposing philosophy in America that is now posed to take total control. This election will decide which way we're going to go. That is the philosophies and so forth of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who followed right on the heels of John Locke. Now, John Locke was an Englishman. He had 300 or 400 years of the Magna Carta, and the Magna Carta evolved. It wasn't one single document. But nonetheless, in France, they were still under the feudal system. And in France, basically, the king, the royalty, and the Catholic Church were the only ones allowed to own land. And as a consequence, you had major poverty in France. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau basically said that we need to liberate these people. And he did it by saying that the state, and this is a social contract, is the key to what's happening today. The state, in relationship to its members, is masters of all good through what he called the social contract, which within the state is the basis of all rights. Now, he designed the government, or the philosophical background for the government, as being basically that the government gives you your rights. They're not God-given. The government defines what rights you have and what you don't, and it can give or take it away as it deems possible. These are what is known by Obama as positive rights, where the state is mandated to give you certain things. It's also the heart of what we now know as progressive ideology, because progressivism has evolved out of the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and we're now infested with it. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said this, that each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. Well, who is the general will? The government. In our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Does that sound a little familiar? Communism, or Marxism. In fact, Karl Marx and John Ingalls and others were students of Rousseau. This is where it all started. It actually goes back to the Greeks, but I'm not going to go back that far. Now, in case you have a doubt in your mind, I want to just show this very short clip of the O'Reilly factor on April 19th a year ago.
Hi, I'm Bill O'Reilly. Thanks for watching us tonight. President Obama and the Social Compact. That is the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo. This week, the president will hold 3 town meetings around the country trying to sell his vision of a strong America based on responsible spending and, quote, the Social Compact. What's that? First, the president talking about Republicans wanting to cut the budget.
This vision is less about reducing the deficit than it is about changing the basic social compact in America. And I don't think there's anything courageous about asking for sacrifice from those who can least afford it and don't have any clout on Capitol Hill. That's not a vision of the America I know.
So again, what is the president talking about? The Social Compact, also called a social contract, was made popular by French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. Basically, Rousseau says that the central government has an obligation to help its citizens in pretty much every way. The dictionary definition of the term social compact is this, quote, an agreement entered into by individuals that results in the formation of the state or of organized society, the prime motive being the desire for protection, which entails the surrender of some or all personal liberties. Very interesting. The desire for protection is not only against Al-Qaeda or Attila the Hun, but also against starving or being homeless. America largely avoided the social compact until the Great Depression in 1929. So many people were suffering that President Roosevelt began the Entitlement Society, that is direct federal help for those who were in trouble economically. In 1935, the Social Security Act was passed providing money for the elderly. Since that time, the federal government has grown enormously, and now America faces economic ruin because it owes more than $14 trillion. Just today, the country's debt level was highlighted worldwide, resulting in a very bad day for the stock market. But still, many Americans, including Mr. Obama, do not want to cut entitlement programs very much. This is the war that is raging throughout America. It is between conservatives who emphasize personal responsibility and achievement against liberals who say the government must take from the wealthy and give to the poor. So it'll be interesting this week to see if President Obama can rally the country to support his vision of a strong social compact. He has compassion on his side. Few Americans want to see their fellow citizens suffer. But the president does have that fiscal responsibility issue haunting him because the country remains in dire trouble. And that's a memo now.
Notice he said $14 trillion. That was just about a year and a half ago. And now it's 16. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Rousseau goes on to say and attacks Christianity much like it's being attacked today. He says the humble Christians turned under a visible leader, Jesus, into the most violent of earthly despotisms. The church, in this case it was the Catholic Church, was not one of the more sterling moments of the Catholic Church. Being founded on lies and errors, deceives men and so forth, and he makes a people bloodthirsty, intolerant, so that it breathes fire and slaughter, killing everyone who does not believe in its God. We're seeing that reemerge today with all of the attacks of our Christian churches. It doesn't mean just the Catholic Church, it's all churches. Basically, the eventual elimination of the ability to worship freely in this country. I'm sure that within 20 years, if we continued on this road, we will have to go underground as Christians because of this philosophy. And he goes on to say that the government can banish from the state whoever does not believe them the religious articles of faith. Now what he did, because he hated Christianity so much, he created a civil religion. We call it secularism today. And this is what he's talking about. Going on, he says, if a person doesn't believe them, the civil religious tenets of faith, let him be punished by death. He has committed the worst of all crimes. Now, I want to propose to you that certainly not all leaders want to basically slay their opposition, but history shows a pretty evil application of this principle. Basically, somewhere between 125 and 200 million citizens have been murdered by their governments because their people were opposing the government. Much like Rousseau said should happen. Now, I'm not saying they're directly correlated, but there's something about this belief system that causes people to be willing to do this kind of thing. If you look at it from the opposite of what I had before, is that the federal government has now all power under this particular model. I call it the feudal ruler model, where the federal government has all power. The state government no longer is sovereign over the federal government, but now is barely an administrator of the federal government, who then administrates the local government, and you and I are basically at the bottom of this. Where our only ability to do anything depends upon what the government allows us to do. We're almost there. The French Revolution, you know, we learned about this in school and so forth, and very often in our students' textbooks, and they equate Locke's version with Rousseau's version, and they basically say both men were after the freedom of man. Well, in a purely technical sense, they were. But they had two radically opposite views of how to get there. Now, we had the Revolutionary War. It was not a nice war. But at least it was something that was a civil type of war. In the case of the French Revolution, it was the bloodiest, nastiest war in modern history, where people were not only killed, but they were actually tied to horses and drawn to yank your limbs apart or your legs off of your body. Gruesome beyond anything that we can, as a society today, can even imagine. Because what it does, this basically, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, opens up Pandora's box within the people who believe this system to something that is usually very brutal. Now, Frederick Bastiat, after the French Revolution, was elected to the French legislature in 1848. He wrote the book, The Law, or a little pamphlet, really, The Law. Many of you, how many of you have read it? Almost half of you at least. If you haven't read it, you need to. I could spend the whole hour just talking about what he said, but nonetheless, one of his observations about socialism and the Rousseau model of governance is that political questions will always be prejudicial, dominant, and all-absorbing. There will be fighting at the door of the legislative place, and the struggle within will be no less furious. Is there any need to offer proof that this odious perversion of the law is a perpetual source of hatred and discord, and it attempts to destroy society itself? He wrote this in 1849. He died the next year. Nonetheless, is that what we're seeing in Washington, D.C., in our state legislatures today? It is pitiful what is going on in politics. Why? Because you have two opposing worldviews that are fighting for power. And especially this progressive mentality is literally tearing this nation apart. Because that's what it's based on. Now, I really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to progressivism other than the fact that it was a thorn in the country's side. until about a year and a half ago when I read this book, The Crowd, The Study of a Popular Mind by Gustave Le Bon, one of the very earliest psychiatrists, in 1895. I could not believe what I was reading. He goes on to say this, that sentiments and ideas of all the persons involved in this kind of activity, this belief system of what we now call progressivism, it wasn't named that then, take one and the same direction and their conscious personality vanishes. We literally see this in many of these meetings or these protests and so forth by these people. It's like they're a mob out there. And you really are describing a mob mentality. A collective mind is formed, but presenting very clearly defined characteristics. Well, what are some of these characteristics? He goes on to say it is no longer himself. If you talk to these people one-on-one, they're very natural, normal people, and you get along and be friends. But he has become an automaton who has ceased to be guided by his own will. It's like he's joined this group and given up all his personal beliefs and so forth to follow whatever the leadership is saying they need to do. And we're seeing that to a T today. Nothing has changed. I could not believe it when I was reading this. They most often have only a very distinct relationship with the observed fact. It's unbelievable some of the things that they want to do. It doesn't have any relationship to fact at all. We just saw or just heard about the spotted owl, which is exactly true biologically. And their only answer is to do more of the same. Everything is irrational. It doesn't follow any rational course of action whatsoever. Global warming, I'll talk about a little bit at noon. Same thing. There is no evidence whatsoever that man is caught. None. There is no scientific evidence at all. Period. Zero. Understand that. No empirical evidence at all that man is causing global warming. And yet, our nation's on a course of utter destruction because of it. They have a sense of invincible power. Don't ever get in their way. They have a contagion of thought. Some leader somewhere in the country thinks of one thing one day, and by the next day, everybody's repeating it. An individual sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest. Nothing shows this more than the entitlement programs. If we continue the way we're going right now, within 10 to 20, 15 years, I'm not even going to say 20 anymore, we will be bankrupt as a country. And yet they persist in going down this road, basically calling anybody that disagrees with them some sort of nut. They commit acts of utter contradiction with their character and habits. They will do things as this group that they would never do as individuals, which is probably true of most of us as well. We need to be careful of that ourselves. The mere fact that he forms a part of an organized crowd or a mob, a man descends several rungs in the ladder of civilization. Isolated, he may be a cultivated individual. In a crowd, he is a barbarian. And we have seen that time after time after time. Without the restraining presence of the representatives of authority, the contradictor, the one who disagrees with the mob, indeed would often be done to death. Now, we haven't seen that per se. I think there might have been a couple deaths that were a result of this, but no, in general, that's not true in this country. It's beginning to happen in Europe. They're about 15 years ahead of us, and you do not know what's going on in Europe. I could sit here and talk to you for 2 hours on what is going on in Europe that you're not hearing about. I don't see there's any way that we can save Europe. It's on its way out. The trouble is that we own $10 trillion worth of European bank debt, which will come back to haunt us. But the riots going on over there are beyond anything that you could ever imagine. Now, this kind of disconnection from reality has led to passing policy and programs and so forth that have literally brought us 3 weeks ago to $16 trillion worth of debt during the Democratic convention. $16 trillion. Now, each of us owes, as a taxpayer, about $140,000 of that. And I hope you brought your pocket change here today and you can start paying down your part of the debt. But that's not the worst of it, folks. Well, we continue to go down this deficit path. Now this was, I copied this a couple weeks ago before they started the new year, economic year. But we were over $1.2 trillion in deficit spending by that time. Nothing has changed. We've been at 1.1, 1.5, $1.6 trillion deficit for the last 4 years. But it's not the major problem. The major problem is our entitlement programs. We have $120 trillion in unfunded liabilities over the next 10 years for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There is no way that that could be paid down. None. These programs, it'll bankrupt us. And those people who have been promised, like myself, I'm on Social Security, many of you are too, all of a sudden that's going to disappear because they won't be able to pay for it. We have to fix it. And yet these progressives refuse to do it. Because why? They want control over your life. The only way that it can be fixed is to privatize at least a portion of that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The only way. But that means giving up control. Right now, if this were to continue and we had to pay off that, it would be $1 million per taxpayer. I don't think that's going to be possible in our lifetimes to pay off $1 million debt. But this is the direct result of progressive activity and control in Congress and our state legislatures. Now, just how much is this? Well, if we take a $100 bill there in the top, and then we have $10,000 worth of $100 bills on the bottom. That shows you the pile that would represent. This is a pile of $100 bills that would equal $1 million. This is $1 billion of $100 bills. This is $1 trillion of $100 bills. This is $15 trillion of $100 bills. And there's $16 trillion down there. And that's 120. Does that give you a visual of really what trouble we're in? And it's all the result. Maybe I shouldn't say all. Nothing's ever always or all. But most of it is due to plans and programs implemented by progressives. And there were progressive Republicans too. Never forget that. This shows up in the way we pay people. Our private compensation, base compensation is $50,000 a year. For federal employees, it's $79,000 a year. So we're paid in our taxes to pay higher salaries to these government employees than we're getting. Many of the school districts, not all of them, in fact, probably not the majority of them, but many of the school districts that are in big trouble right now, or the states that are in big trouble right now, have school districts or public employees that have the same kind of disproportionate relationship of their salaries to the private sector. When you actually include base, it gets worse, or the fringe. The average fringe for most people, or for more private industry, is about $60,000, a base plus fringe. For federal employees, it's $120,000. It's double. No wonder people want to go to work for the federal government. It's a gravy train. And yet those people will say they're worth every dime. Because they think that you should have the right to tell you what you can do and not do. Occupy Wall Street, I can go into that, I just don't have time right now, is another aspect of this that's supported by the progressives. This is something that was done by the progressives. They were behind it. And what started all that? You go back to 1970, Rules for Radicals by Saul D. Alinsky. I just want to give you a point here. This book, in the dedication, was to the very first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that at least he won his own kingdom, Lucifer. Now, if you go by the book today, you won't find this dedication in there. They've taken it out for obvious reasons. But you're talking about Satan. And for those of you who are Christians, have an understanding, you know, if this is really dedicated to Satan or Lucifer, who is the father of all lies, then the whole system is predicated on a lie. In this book, he goes on, we are concerned with how to create mass organizations to seize power and give it to the people. That's what the purpose of all this agitation and so forth is all about. You know, they bankrupted New York City in the 1980s and 90s using this technique. They want to bankrupt this country too. That's their goal. And he goes on to say that Marxist begins with his prime truth that all evils are caused by the exploitation of the proletariat by the capitalists. So not only do they hate Christianity, they hate capitalism. They despise capitalism. From this, he logically proceeds to the revolution to end capitalism, and then into the third stage of reorganization into a new social order of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is pure Rousseau. And finally, the last stage, the political paradise of communism. This is the handbook for all progressives, the progressive leadership especially. Now, I want to caution you that not all liberals are progressives. In fact, I would say the vast majority of liberals probably are liberal because that's what they've been taught in our public school systems. You're a product of what you know. And if they never teach the other side of the story, the principles of the Constitution and so forth, how are people supposed to know otherwise? And the key thing that I have found with liberals is that they generally want to do the right thing. Now, they're following the progressive mode of government and so forth, but if they really understand and begin to realize how dangerous it is, they can be convinced that they're wrong. Krauthammer, the famous columnist and so forth, used to be a liberal. And he woke up one day and said, this isn't working. This is diametrically opposed to what will work to create a free society. And now he's one of the staunchest conservatives I've ever seen. And he goes on to say this, and this is a key point. The third rule of ethics of means and ends is that in war, understand that the people who are really at the forefront of this believe that they're in a war against you and I, and against the Constitution of the United States. They believe they're at war, and they will do anything. It goes on to say it justifies almost any means to attain that. So you can't trust anything they say. You literally cannot trust anything that they say, because they will tell you anything to try to get that one little more step towards what their ultimate goal will be. And you can see it if you go back through history. They make all these promises and they never keep them. That leads to an incoherence in logic. And I just want to touch on this just a little bit. Pelosi has, I really truly think that she's certifiable. I really do. She doesn't even live on planet Earth. She said this, of course she said a lot of things that I could use. What we're trying to do is to save the world from the Republican budget. This was a year ago. We're trying to save life on this planet as we know it today. The thing is that she believes that. She really honestly believes that. because these people live in a state of delusion. Listen to Kerry, our former presidential candidate. Whoops, went too far.
The debt deal that we just did is barely a scratch on the surface of what we need to do. We have to change the minds of those people in the House of Representatives who have completely inappropriately left out any kind of plans whatsoever for how you create jobs and grow America. The Congress was taken hostage, the country, the economy was taken hostage. The President had no choice here. Congress had no choice here. We did the same thing the President had to do, which is save America from a default. The media in America has a bigger responsibility than it's exercising today. The media has got to begin to not give equal time or equal balance to an absolutely absurd notion just because somebody says it, or simply because somebody says something which everybody knows is not factual. It doesn't deserve the same credit as a legitimate idea about what you do. And the problem is everything's put into this tit-for-tat equal battle, and America is losing any sense of what's real, of who is accountable, of who is not accountable, of who is real, who isn't.
One of the things you have to recognize with these people is that they think they have all the answers. In fact, they know they have all the answers. And that everybody else is a bunch of dumbheads. Go on to Paul Krugman. Why is it that they think they could just keep expanding the government and the debt and so forth of the country? Krugman answers this. Now, he's the progressive of all progressives working for the New York Times. When he goes on to say that people in D.C. talk about the deficits and debt, by and large, they have no idea what they're talking about, and the people who talk the most understand the least. Now, understand, he's talking about you and I. Families have to pay back their debt. Governments don't. Simple, straight answer. All they need to do is ensure that their debt grows more slowly than their tax base. Did you know right now that China is leveling a major global attack on the U.S. dollar to remove it as a world reserve currency? If that happens, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that are going to go back to the United States just like that. And we will have hyperinflation. And that's what China's trying to do because of our debt and our deficit spending. We need more, not less government spending to get us out of our unemployment trap. Since when has government created employment? And the wrong-headed, ill-informed obsession with debt is standing in the way. They don't care about debt. They believe that we can run up as much debt as we want to. Let's see what
it's possible to open a newspaper
our fearless leader of the Senate
without hearing my Republican colleagues talk about the evils of job-killing regulations. That's in quotes. Each day they arrive in the Senate floor to rail against the safeguards that keep our water clean, our air fresh, and our minds safe. Republicans would have you believe that these common sense rules that check the greed of Wall Street banks, keep huge corporations honest, and stop big oil's unnecessary risk-taking, are also causing small businesses great harm. My Republican friends have yet to produce a single shred of evidence that the regulations they hate so much do the broad economic harms they claim. That's because there aren't any.
Unbelievable. The CBO, about 2 months ago, came out with a study of Obamacare and said that Obamacare is probably going to require about 90 million man-hours in private industry to implement. And it has no cost? What planet does this guy live on? You know yourself in the natural resources management or wherever you're working and so forth, how much regulations are hindering your business. Now, modern studies of this phenomenon go on to say this. Now, he talks about the liberal mind. I talk about progressives. And he's really talking about progressives because most liberals aren't like this. In fact, I think that less than 10% of the population is truly progressive. And they're all in Congress and their state legislatures and so forth. They have a craving for power. They really want power over everyone else because they know they're right. Their way is the only way. He says that under careful scrutiny, progressive liberalism's distortions of the normal ability to reason can be only understood as a product of psychopathology. In other words, they're not operating on a full deck. They can't connect to reality. You know, I used to be hesitant in saying that, but I mean, everything that I've seen the last several years has just reinforced that idea. The modern liberal mind, its distorted perceptions and its destructive agenda are the product of disturbed personalities. I can go into some of the things that I have learned over the last year or so, but most of the problem that I see, and what's causing the delusion, is that they have and they harbor tremendous amounts of bitterness and anger from a variety of sources earlier in their life. And when you get that bitter and you get that angry, you see things that aren't real. Literally can see. I've sat in counseling, sat across the table from two fighting couples, and one of them say, "See, that's what I'm talking about. That they did these kind of things. They did nothing of the sort, but that's what that person saw, and it's caused by bitterness." He goes on to say that radical liberalism is in fact a form of madness. 4 more years of the current administration, I think, will put us over the edge. You've heard many things this morning about how we need to get involved in political campaigns, and I can't help but reinforce that. We have basically a month left. I'm not going to do that. I don't have enough time to get into the economic side of it. Come on. This is in my book, by the way, Plundered. It's not wanting to move along here. There. One of the things that I do want to mention, though, is that Sweden, now most of us have learned in school that Sweden is probably one of the most socialistic countries in Europe. And Sweden, in the late 1990s, suddenly woke up and realized, hey, this isn't working, folks. We're running out of other people's money. And they switched from the Keynesian philosophy of a marketplace, which we're in right now. That's what Obama's been trying to implement all 4 years. In fact, Bush before him and so forth. And Sweden has turned back to what is called the Austrian economic model of economics, of conservatism, small government, and so forth. Now, they have a long ways to go. But the unique thing about Sweden is that they did it early enough, starting in the early 2000s, where they have not suffered from this recession at all. In fact, their gross domestic product has been 2 to 4% greater than that of the United States. Whereas always before, they were well behind that of the United States. The belief system that you employ really does make a difference. And this just came out this week. The impact of federal policies on the economy, where they went back over 100 years and analyzed the economics of the different periods of time, that the faster government spending increases, the relative to the economy, the more slowly the economy grows. Have we seen that the last 4 years? I guess we have. The average dollar spent by government results in about 2/3 of a dollar of reduced private sector spending. We've seen that too. For every additional government worker, roughly a half of a private worker disappears. So the creation of public servants, public employees, really doesn't solve that. And all this green alternative energy in Europe and so forth, for every green job they created over there, they lost 2 to 5 jobs in the private sector. Decades in which the top marginal rate of income tax increase were decades of inferior economic growth and stock market performance. Deficit spending does not stimulate the economic growth, but it does stimulate inflation, depreciates the value of the dollar, and which is inflation, and lowers labor productivity. This is what this study showed over the last 100 years. And boy, are we right in the middle of it right now. And 4 more years of the same policies will probably finish us off. We've already lost between $4,000 and $5,000 of income per family in the last 4 years because of Obama's policies. And here is the reason why. Keynesian economics just doesn't work. You're going to like this. This was back in 1979. Milton Friedman was an economic advisor to Ronald Reagan, and he nails it.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think a communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us.
Well,
I don't even trust you to do that. I don't even trust you to do that.
I don't think the economic system that is most desirable could not be said better than this little 2-minute clip. He really nails it. And I'm running out of time, but what we're seeing here is the lock bottle of government, the people's law, that has given us the liberties and so forth that we have enjoyed, is being rapidly taken over by the progressive ideology and instituting the Rousseau feudal ruler model of government, of downward control of the government over the people. And we're almost there. We're one election away from being there. And I'm up against my time right now. I'll leave here and we'll come back to many of the other subjects that I want to this afternoon. But it's imperative that we get out there, put some shoe leather on the concrete and the asphalt, and help the elected official that you think will do what you want to have done. It could be dog catchers for all I care. I don't care where you're involved, but get involved. If you have to miss a year of the Monday Night Football, do it. It's not that these other activities you're going to see this afternoon when I come back, all of these other things that take us away from what we should be focusing on has been done deliberately. And we now need to be able to start taking our country back, not only in this election, but the next election and the election after that, because it's not going to happen overnight. Well, thank you. I'll come back again this afternoon.